In this video, we're going to be working with the CSS Grid. Up to before the grid existed, it was pretty hard to create layouts. First, we used tables, then we moved to floating things, and then Flexbox came. But it wasn't really until the CSS Grid came up that things got a lot better and a lot simpler for us. Now, right now, the best resource to learn how the CSS Grid works is actually from csstricks.com, and it's called A Complete Guide to Grid, and it's just a fantastic resource. So if you want to really get into depth on this, you can come here and go through the whole thing. It details everything. There is examples, there's schematics. It really gets to the technical level. Now, on the video that we're going to be working on today, I'm going to show you how to use the most basic parts of the CSS grids so you can actually create a layout. Again, once you get that, you're welcome to come back to the csstricks.com and you can experiment with the rest of the stuff that we're not going to cover on the video. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to need is we're of course going to need a file with some elements already, and I don't want to spend the whole video building the elements, so here it is, the structure that I have. So let me open this with Atom. You can open it with any text editor you want. In this case, today I just feel like working with Atom, which I also love. Before we start coding, let's always analyze the structure of the HTML document that we have. So we have a document that has a container div, so everything is inside the container div. Then we have a header section. There's an H1 on the header section. There's also an app with 5 elements on it. Now we're not going to format the navigation right now, but I wanted to have that anyway. And maybe we can cut it down to 3 just for our purposes here. So 5 is too many. And my apologies. After that, we have a main. Now this main has 3 sections inside. Each section has an H2 paragraph and a couple paragraphs right there. So that just repeats, section 1, section 2, and section 3. These are going to be part of the main, so they're not going to be part of the grid. So kind of as we go, keep that in mind, okay? They're inside the main, and basically I added them to put some volume into our content so it looked more like a web page. The other thing that we have here already is a link to an style sheet here. It's called main style. And if you want to work with an internal style for the exercise, that's fine. You can just put your style tags there and you can follow along any which way you want. So pause the video, go ahead and make sure you create a similar structure to this. And then once you're ready, let's continue. Alright, so let's assume that you're ready and you have your HTML, and right now it should be looking something like this. Very plain but solid structure. Make sure you also validate your code. I'm going to put it here on the side for right now, and let me call Atom here, and let's put this side by side, and let me resize the window so you can see as we're coding this thing. I'm also going to close the project pane here. We don't need it, so close pane right there. And let me see. And of course, it didn't close. But we can also do it like this. So there it goes. All right. So now we have a little bit more room to work on this thing. All right. So let's get to it. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to set some basic style so we can tell the difference between the sections. So let's go ahead and start working on it. So I'm going to start by setting the box sizing. That's going to be border box. All right. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to set a header and footer. So header and footer, and we're going to give them the same formatting so we don't spend a lot of time. So background, we're just going to make it high contrast, so black, and we're going to set the color to white, so F, and we're going to set a padding to make it more appealing to the eye, so 10 pixels padding. And that's why we have a box sizing border box, to avoid all those things that come with dealing with the box model. and I like to preview as I go. So save all. See, I press the right one. And we're gonna refresh, and there we go. We have the header, and I don't think we have a footer. So, and there it is. So I had to move my window to allow me to scroll. I think I have a lot of text on the footer, so let me cut it a little bit here. So we go there, and I'm just gonna say this is the footer. Much easier. So let's see, file, save all, preview, and sorry, refresh. There it is. Going back to the styles, let's enter something also for the nav. So let's see, for this one we're just going to set a background, and let's do a shade of gray. So let's do light shade of gray, that'll be 999, and we're also going to set padding. So let's do padding, same 10 pixels. All right, and let's move with the, we're also going to do something with the sections so we can tell them apart. And so let's do section. Let's add some padding to all of them. So just 5 pixels should do enough. And then we're gonna take the odd and even sections and making kind of a stripe right now. So section, we put a pseudo class, and of type I'm gonna say odd, and we're gonna set that one background, see, another shade of gray, so light one. And then the even, which is gonna be number 2, let's not work harder but smarter. So let me see, we copy, paste, and we just say even, and we're gonna change it a little bit to maybe a darker color, I don't know. So let's see how it's looking. Let's do 555, kind of right in the middle. So file, save all, we preview, and now we can tell the different sections apart. So we have a header, we have a menu, we have the 3 sections. You know, the menus kind of bother me a little bit, so let's change the color of the nav, and I'm gonna use my traditional shade of blue, and in that case I'm also change the color to white. So all right, so see, semicolon, file, save all, and see how this looks. All right, there you go. So now we can tell them apart a little bit better here. So there's a footer, there's a nav, these 3 sections are the main, and we are ready to start working with the CSS grid. So the first thing we need to do is identify our container on the grid. Now, if we go back to the HTML code, very conveniently there is already, and let me scroll this way, there's already a div ID that I'm using a container. Now remember, I'm using a div ID because this work is explicitly and exclusively for presentation. So that's why we're not using semantic tags in this case for the container, so that's important. All right, so this is a container, and the areas that I'm going to be laying out is going to be the header, the nav, the main. Now remember, the main has 3 sections, but they're not part of this right now, and then the footer. So those are the 4 areas that I'm going to be laying out. So first thing, again, identify which one is the container of the areas that you're going to be using to create your layout. All right, so I know it's a container ID, so now I'm going to go here on my CSS, and I'm going to even put a comment. I'm going to put this CSS grid work. Now I'm gonna have to come and reuse some of the tags on the top, but this is kind of how we're gonna go about. So step number 1, we're gonna set the container as a grid area. All right, so container ID, and open curly brackets, crack them open, and we say display, and we're gonna say grid. All right, now let's see, file, save all, refresh, and of course nothing happened because it's laid out like that. All right, so let's continue. Next thing we're going to do, and this is where the understanding starts. Okay, so we're displaying this as a grid, but we're gonna set the grid area as columns. All right, so bear with me. So we're gonna do grid template areas, and it's going to be, sorry, grid template columns. That's what we're setting, and notice that it's plural. And what we're gonna use, if we're gonna use a design grid of 12 columns, okay, and I'm gonna divide them in thirds. So basically I'm gonna have 4 areas. All right, so I'm gonna use 3FR for fraction, 3FR, 3FR, and 3FR, okay, and then I'm gonna put a semicolon. Now what I'm doing here is divide them in columns. So right now I have 4 columns, equal columns, and if you notice, the total of my numbers are 12. Now doesn't really make a difference how many numbers you choose. You can do it on base 10 or 18 or 16, whatever you want, but a 12 column grid is very useful because you can divide it by 2s, by 3s, by 4, of course by 6, you know, and then you can make a lot more combinations with any other layout. And so let me go back to this. So let's say that I want like the first column to use half of the total space. In that case, I can just put 6, and then the other 2 columns are gonna take half of the space. So you can combine these any which way you want. Now this is not really part of the columns, so you need to understand the concept of design in columns. So if you want to pause the video and go and research a little bit about the 12 grid column design style, you're welcome. Now for the example, and to make it easier to understand for us, I'm going to stick to the 3 frames. All right. Now the CSS Grid also has a way that you can tell it to repeat these things, but again, that's part of there's many different ways about creating it. From my perspective, this is one of the best ways to understand it. So we're gonna leave it like that, and then make sure once you create something, a couple of combinations, make sure you experiment with these numbers until you understand this. All right. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna set the grid template for the rows. So I'm gonna say rows, and we're gonna set that one to auto. That'll be the equivalent of dealing with the height, which in HTML you don't always do. So we're just gonna set it to auto, so that way it's automatically going to adapt to it. Again, if you want finer control of this, you can absolutely go back and review this once you understand it. All right, so that's where we are right now. All right, so once we have the columns, I'm also going to use the setting the areas. That's the way I'm going about. Again, different ways of doing it. From my perspective, this is one that shows you visually what you're doing in one of the best way. So I'm gonna set the grid template areas now. Okay, now this is where the strange things are going to start happening. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next line. I'm going to open quotations and close the quotations, of course. And then I'm going to name the areas that I want to use. So in this case, I'm just gonna go with the same names that we've been using. So I'm going to use header. Okay, so I'm gonna say header space header in header. So that's 4 times. So that's my first row, and those are my columns. Okay, now what you need to watch here is notice that I'm using 4. So if I have 3 fractions here, I'm using 4 fractions here. I'm using 4 of these things here. All right, and the whole thing hopefully is going to be more clear when we finish laying it out. So that's going to be. Now I'm going to do the second row here, and I'm going to put the nav. Oh, by the way, I put a capital H right here. So thank you for notice, those of you that did. And then I'm going to select the second one, and I'm going to say nav, and nav4. So now the second row is going to be used by the nav. Then I'm going to set the third one, and I'm going to give it to the main. So right now I'm just basically doing it exactly the way it is. So main, and then I'm going to go with the last one, and I'm going to say footer, and footer. So 4 footers. All right, now let me lay it out this so it looks clearer. Let me do this like this. So I'm aligning this so you can actually see it. It's kind of like of a table if you think about it. So let me see, footer, main. Let me go extreme on this thing. footer. Okay, let me take this one down. All right, so now hopefully you can see it. It's sort of a table. So you have header, this whole thing is the nav, the main, and then we have the footer. Now at the end of the last one, when I finish laying out my grid, I'm going to put a semicolon here. So there it is. Now let's see what craziness is going on here. So if I go file and save all, oh, by the way, on Atom, when you haven't saved something, you're gonna see that little blue dot. If you're using any text editor, some of them had an asterisk or something, but anyway. So I'm gonna go file and I'm gonna save all, right? And now if I come here and refresh, it's going to do this kind of a weird thing. See how it's setting up my columns and it's squishing the content right here. Now the reason for that is because this header, nav, and main and footer, it sounds like the tags that we have, but we actually have to name those areas before we can actually use the grid, which is the next step that we're going to do. So I'm going to start with the header. So I don't want to duplicate my code, so if I have a header footer combination, so I guess I can do it here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say header, okay, and I'm going to now I'm going to name it. So grid area, and I'm going to say header. All right, so I'm gonna do the same with the main. I don't have a main here, so I'm just gonna do it right here. So main, again, grid area, it's gonna be main. Then I'm going to do the nav. Now for the nav, I have a tag here, so I can do this. So grid area, this is going to be nav semicolon, and then all I have to do is the footer. Now I don't have a tag for the footer, so I'm gonna add one right here after the nav. So footer, and my code probably could be organized better, you know, but grid area, and I'm gonna name it footer. Okay, so now I have all my areas named. Now if I go file again, save all, and I refresh, it's going to show me the layout. Now you might say, well, that is the same layout we started with, right? And you'll be correct. But let's take a look at these things that we can do here. Now let me go back to my CSS here for what I named this. All right, but this is a cool stuff. Let's say that I want the nav to occupy all the first column, okay? So now, because I named it, I have total control of how I want to lay this out. So let me move this here. All right, so I'm gonna say nav. I'm going to put the nav right here also, and I'm going to put the nav right here. Now this is of course not going to work, because if you notice, my nav is doing kind of like an L shape, like a T shape kind of here, so that's not going to work. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the main here, okay, and I'm going to move the main here, and I'm also going to move the main right here. Okay, so if we look at it now, I have all these. First column is going to be the nav. The header is going to use the top, the columns on the first row, columns 2, 3, and 4. So it's going to be right here, and the nav is going to cut right here. The main is going to use all this area, and the footer is also going to be kind of like the header. Now let's try it. So I'm gonna go file, save all, and if I do this, now notice how my navigation is there. My header's here, exactly what I tell it to use, right? Now this is really cool. Now we can change it to anything that we want. Let's say I want the header to use this section, and then the nav use the rest. So all I have to do now is say header, okay, file, save all again, I refresh. Now my header is using that, and my nav is using the rest. So if I want my footer to extend all the way here, I can go here and I can say footer. Now if you look at it, all my footer is going to be using all the bottom. The nav is going to use the first column on the middle, and the main is going to use the rest of the space. So file, save all, there you go. So again, this is CSS Grid allows you to do whatever you want, as long as it makes sense. If you have L shapes here or T's, like, that's not gonna work. See, if I stick main right here, the content cannot be vented on an L shape. So let's see what it does, but it's gonna be something kind of weird. Let's see. See, it throws everything off. So if you see this thing, you're having problems, that check your grid, imagine it's a table, and make sure that it makes a sense. So you can have blocks, straight lines that up or down, but you cannot have L shapes or T shapes or anything like that. Let me correct it. File, save all. All right. So another cool thing about this, let's say that I want some empty space for some reason here. I only want the header to use 2 columns, let's say. I can actually come here, and if I add a dot and then another dot, that's going to cause an empty space right on my grid. So let's see, save all, refresh, and now those dots are telling it not to occupy any space right here. All right, now that is not what I want, so let me put it back, and let me put this back header. All right, so file, save all. All right, now let me show you something really cool too. Let's say I want the footer actually right below the header. With the CSS grid, you can actually control that positioning too. So I'm actually going to take all this row here, so Control X, I'm gonna paste it right after the header, and don't forget the semicolon here. That semicolon is very important. So I'm gonna say File, Save All, and now the footer is going to be right below the header. So you can control the positioning of these elements any which way you want. So go ahead, make sure you experiment with this a little bit and feel comfortable. One more thing I'm going to show you though is the grid gap. So let's say that you want to create some separation between the elements here. Okay, there's something that you can use instead of margins that is more useful. It's called the grid gap. Okay, so now you can say the grid gap for the row, grid column gap or grid row gap, you know, but you can also use the shorthand, which I think is easier. So if I say 5 pixels here, okay, that's sorry, px. Okay, this is going to set a gap on the columns and between the rows of 5 pixels. So if I want them separated a little bit, not a problem. So save all. I'm gonna say refresh, and there you go. Now, if I want only separation on the columns but not on the rows, then I'm gonna use 2 numbers. So I'm gonna say 0, for example, for the row, and then 5 pixels for the column. So the first number again, row. The second number is columns. So when I refresh, so file, save all. When I refresh, the separation on the rows are going to disappear, and this is the only one that is going to remain. All right, let's test it. So there you go. If I want the opposite, I can set this one to 0 and this one to 5 pixels, and then the separation is going to be on the rows only. So see, so that's kind of, again, you have full control of whatever you want to do with your layout, and so practice, and I think you're gonna be able to create very awesome websites using CSS Grid. So that's really all I have for the grid. Now, before we leave, I'm just gonna give you a little bit teaser. So there's another display that is really cool, and I'm gonna apply it to the main. So this is the flex. So look at this. So if, let's say I want these sections right now into columns also. You might think, well, I can set another grid, but you don't have to. There's something very similar called display flex. So I'm gonna say flex, and that's all I have to do. Watch. So when I go file, I'm gonna say save all. I'm gonna refresh, and now these things are like that. So how cool. Now we'll expand more on this display flex, but on another occasion. But again, CSS Tricks has also awesome resources on the Flexbox. So I hope you enjoyed this video, you had some fun, and remember, the only way to master this is to practice, but this is going to free you to create any layouts that you want to create. So just think of it, write it down on a piece of napkin, and then use the CSS grid to create your layouts. I'll catch you on the next video.